Well, welcome. This is our second episode in our podcast here in New Mexico. My name is Arik Kotkowski Baca, and I'm here joined by Michael Perry, who's running for land commissioner. I'm going to go straight in. Michael, what is a land commissioner and why does it matter?
Well, it's a good question, but it's not a bad question by any means, because honestly, a lot of people don't know what the land commissioner is or does. And while I'd like to say it's a very, very important job from my lane, it's a very, very important job in your line of thinking. It's because basically the land commissioner does two things in this state, and I'll sum it up really easily. Is it's supposed to make money off of the landscape, and it's supposed to take care of the landscape. And when I say the land, there's approximately 9 million acres of surface area in this state that belongs to the state land office. So to put it further in layman's terms, you kind of take that in a ranching atmosphere and say, we're going to take all the money derived from that 9 million acres and we're going to direct that funding directly to public schools. And last year it was in the tune of between 2.5 and 2.6 billion dollars that was economic revenue gained off the state land that went directly to public schools.
Interesting.
The other side of it is taking care of the landscape for future generations, which is what I've been doing my whole life. So that part is going to be easy for me to dive into that, and I just simply can't wait to get my hands on state land.
Well, it certainly is important, but why is it an elected position? What do New Mexicans need to know when they get to the voting booth and they say, I'm going to cast a vote for Michael Perry? What specifically could a land commissioner do to influence or change the direction that we're heading towards in the state?
Well, when you look at national issues, and it's basically things are going more towards an environmental perspective of how we need to take care of Mother Earth, so to speak. And I absolutely believe that. I'm entrenched in that. I think we need to take care of the landscapes for future generations because we all have kids, and I would love for my grandchildren to be hunting and doing the things that I'm doing on the same landscapes that they are now. And I want to make them more beautiful than they are. One of the reasons it's important when I talk about land management issues is, you look at things like what have we been doing historically that is wrong and what is right now. And what is right now is increasing our resiliency on fire, starting to create a habitat that can live with fire. Because what's happened over the last probably 50 years, just in my lifetime, is we've had a woody fuels increase. We've had a decrease in timber management, which is horrible for New Mexico. It's horrible for the rural economies. So timber management has really been put by the wayside, especially on federal properties. And as a result, over the last 40 to 50 years, we've had fires. We've had a lot of fires, and what they call them now is catastrophic wildfires. And I think that's the reason for that is because we just didn't take care of the landscapes like we used to take care of the landscapes. We decreased timber management, and over time, when you don't cut trees, you got more trees. And when you got more trees, 50 years later, you got catastrophic wildfire issues. And in between there's a whole lot of other things that affected the economies of that those rural conditions and those rural jobs that allow people to live in those areas. And take yourself, for example, it's really, really hard. It'd be really, really hard for you to make a living out in rural America, but it's a lot easier to come to town and find a good paying job because they're
That's
just
for
not
sure.
out there anymore. They're just not out there. So I'd like to get back to creating an environment where we can make money off the landscapes and get people back into nature where they should be. I'm a conservationist is what people need to understand. And a conservationist is a person that really, really looks at and enjoys the wise use of natural resources. I'm not a preservationist. And a lot of times that's what the other side of the party is going for, is more of a preservation mindset. And that preservation mindset puts things over in a little area and they don't really use it. It's not used, and it kills business models, which is killing rural America.
This is an interesting point you just raised, especially on timber management. Why do you think the state didn't focus so much on that? Like, what changed in the ideology or philosophy of the land office that eventually permitted or caused these wildfires in New Mexico?
Well, it's a historic issue, and it's I can go back and say it started back in. I'll give you an example. It started in my lifetime in the 90s. I was just graduated from high school and went to New Mexico State University. And we had a field trip to the Lincoln National Forest. And as we got there, the Forest Service personnel and biologists were talking about the Endangered Species Act and the need to protect the spotted owl. And basically what it boiled down to is the spotted owl needed a certain type of tree, old growth forest, and because of timber management, or their version of timber management, this species was in peril. So as a result, through the endangered species management, they killed all of the timber management issues. Killed all. Let me break there. We'll have to break that a little bit. So as a result of that, in the 90s, the timber management issue greatly decreased. And as the timber management decreases, you got less people that are going to stores and buying chainsaws, gas stations. All of a sudden, you don't need groceries. People can't make a living off the timber management. So that economy really, really shrank. So then you got nobody using that resource. And as a result, the woody vegetation has increased over time. So if you look at it from a biological perspective, back in the day, way back in the day, you can take it 150, 200 years ago, everybody knows you can cut a big old tree in half. And when you cut that big old tree in half, you can flip it over and you can look at those growth rings.
Yeah.
And you can look back in time, and everybody knows that. You can look back, oh, I was born here, and Christopher Columbus was here, and all this. But the really important thing about that knowledge is when you look at those trees, you can also see that there's a black growth ring every once in a while. And you can go back in time, and the black growth ring was caused by fires. And what would happen back in the day is there was a big tree, and then maybe 200 yards, and then a big tree, and that fire would burn on the grass. It would burn up to the base of the tree, and around the base of the tree, it would kind of char it, and that would create that growth ring. So over time, you could say there was a fire in 1798. There was one in 1830. You could tell when the propensity of fires happened in a natural environment. And what has happened now is you just look at some of these fires that have happened in areas since you and I have been alive. It's been 50 years there's been any timber management. There's been 50 years since there's been a fire. So you have all this growth that happens in between those big trees. And instead of the fire burning on the ground now and burning on the grass and burning a little shrub and burning a little tree, it climbs that tree over there's a 10-year-old tree, a 15-year-old tree, a 20-year-old tree, and it gets up to your 100-year-old tree, and it burns them all. And essentially, it kills everything. It kills every tree on the planet that goes through that fire. And you go from 100% canopy to a 0% canopy. And let's talk about what that means for watershed health and watershed management. Why is the tree canopy important for watershed health? And everybody knows that when it rains in a pasture or rains in the forest, do you run out to the meadow or do you run to the tree? People run to the tree because they don't want the rain hitting on them. So they run to the tree. And when you're under that tree, you're actually safe from a heavy rainfall. And when you look down at the ground, there's really not much rain that's coming onto the ground. And if you look at the tree, it's also called a drip edge. Everything underneath that where the water falls, there's no vegetation growing there. But on the edge of that, there is vegetation, and that's where the grass is, and that's where you just ran to get under the tree so you don't have rain falling on your head. So over years, with the decrease in grass fires and the decrease in those the fires that we've Endangered Species Act essentially killed, and the timber management agencies that were negatively affected, we have all these trees going in between them. So you've got trees everywhere now. So you went from back in 100 years ago, maybe having a 20% canopy cover. Now you have 100% canopy cover. So if you think about standing under in the forest when it rains, there's no water hitting the ground. There's no rainfall that's actually hitting the ground. And there's a lot of studies that say, depending on the slope and the intensity of the rain and a lot of things that factor in. But if you got 100% canopy and you get a 1-inch rain, less than 2/10 of the rain actually hits the ground.
Interesting.
That's a lot of water that we're leaving in the trees. The tree's catching it. The tree's doing its thing. It's doing its photorespiration. It's growing. But you got too many trees catching the water is what's happening. So then you get a fire that happens like in Las Vegas, where you get the one in Ruidoso, which is just down the road from where we live. That went from 100% capacity, 100% the 100%, what was I calling it?
Canopy.
Huh? We'll have to cut
Canopy
that,
cover?
but, 100% canopy. Yeah. So essentially, if you look at that Ruidoso area, it had 100% canopy cover. So when that rain was hitting, less than 2/10 of it was getting down into the arroyos and giving us water that goes down to Pecos and our farmers use. Now that that catastrophic wildfire has come through, Ruidoso flooded 6 times last year because it went from 100% capacity to 0 capacity as far as keeping that water on the hill. The watershed has really, really increased because there's nothing on the landscapes to hold the water back. So Mother Nature has hit the reset button and said, you guys are doing it wrong. We need to get back to watershed management. We need to get back to what the system used to be. And that's when rain would fall, it would percolate down through the grass, get into the arroyos and gently flow down, and then go to the Pecos River, and we water with our canals and our acequias or whatever we're calling them. That's how we have our agricultural production. That's not happening anymore. So I take that again. If you look at that back in the 1980s when I was a kid, the Hondo River used to flow through Roswell 2-3 months a year, and it was always in the summer. And now I look back and I go, that was during the rainy season in Ruidoso, because all that rain would hit, it would percolate down, and then we'd have a nice water flow down the Hondo River. It didn't happen in 2000. It didn't happen in 2010s when I was a game warden running all over that state, all over that country. We didn't have the water events like we did. And it's because that dense undergrowth of trees grew up in such a fashion that the watershed management was compromised, and we were no longer getting water downstream. So as a result, we all have less water in the cities. Now that's been totally reversed by Mother Nature through the term of catastrophic wildfires, and we have flooding. And I just met a couple of weeks ago, I was actually in Washington, D.C., and one of the Forest Service officials that was just recently appointed was talking to us about FEMA dollars. And it said that for every conservation effort that you spend $1 on the ground, you save 7 FEMA dollars through catastrophic events. Well, I saw another article that said the Ruidoso mayor came out and said it's going to cost $1 billion to get Ruidoso back to where it was because of all the infrastructure that has burned and or washed away from the 6 floods. As you know, we don't have a racetrack anymore in Ruidoso. It's flooded 2 or 3 or 4 times, and they can't rebuild it. It's going to have to move and go somewhere else because of the watershed and the poor forest health. So when you look at those numbers of 1 to 7, the Forest Service or whoever are the powers that be on the landscape would have had to spend about $120 million, $180 million on conservation projects to keep that watershed where it needed to be to save those dollars. We just never do that anymore. But the timber management, if we would allow people to cut wood, if we would allow the timber management agencies to flourish, they will do that for us. In 1990, the U.S. Forest Service harvested about 13 billion board feet of wood across the United States. Last year, it was under 2 billion board feet. So over 50 years, that's a lot of board feet that was reduced. And now, because of the preservation mindset and preservation management, we're literally letting it burn up. We have all that money that we could have used, all the houses that we could have allowed people to heat through just simple wood cutting.
Yeah.
All the buildings that we might have been able to make through timber management, we simply let burn up. And now we're spending $7 federally to correct those actions that would have cost us $1 if we would have just done some conservation management. So in my opinion, what can the state land office or the state land commissioner do is that's the parcels of property that are state land, that are blue on the map, that are anywhere near a residential area, we need to do our best to decrease the woody vegetation that would increase our watershed runoff. And that's actually what the residents need. You know, there's a lot of places where you can't even get insurance on homes anymore. The Ruidoso, it's very, very hard to get insurance on a home because those insurance providers look at it and say, yeah, this is a no-go for us. We're going to lose money because one match is going to burn all this down and we're out of money. It's a very tenuous situation that a lot of these people living in forested areas need to realize. And I think the federal government's a little bit culpable because I think over time we've allowed that timber management to decrease, which has increased catastrophic events and is really hurting us in the long run.
What's interesting about this is a conversation I have with my friends quite often, which is the difference between conservation and environmentalism and how they're very distinct, or preservation, as you called it. When you talk to environmentalists or preservationists, they mean well, right? Everybody wants to have, I mean, more tree cover sounds amazing. When you say we have more trees now than we did 50, 60 years ago, that seems like good news. Turns out it isn't.
Well, I think the science would show that it isn't. So when I have a little private company that I haven't been working at a lot lately because I've been on the campaign trail, but it's called Wildlife and Habitat Prescriptions. And really what I do, I call it prescriptions because you really have to go out and specifically look at a landscape and say, wow, this is a really good watershed. We could make a dirt tank over here, catch some water. We could have some browse species over here that are good for mule deer management. That's called conservation. That's the wise use of natural resources. That's looking at the landscape and going, it could provide for us a lot more than it is right now. The preservation mindset says we're not going to touch it. We're going to leave it alone. We're going to let it grow. And it's an emotional thing for a lot of environmentalists. It's not a correct thing. It is emotional because they want to see all those trees. They love all those trees. But I would challenge a lot of people that call themselves environmentalists. And what is a healthy forest look like? And I bet you they can't answer, but I can answer because there's a word called monotypical. And when you look at the sandias, when I came up here today, driving from Roswell to visit with you, when you look at the backside of the sandias, it's very what I would call monotypical. And monotypical is it's the same. It's got the same species of trees. It's got the same diameter of trees, the same height of trees. It's the same. That's dangerous when you're talking about wildlife management and watershed management, because what you need is diversity on the ground to create diversity in species on the ground, grasses, shrubs, browse, which in turn creates diversity in the wildlife that utilizes it. So right now, there's less critters and creatures using our forests than there ever has been because we have failed to adequately conserve the landscapes. We're just not doing it anymore. We're preserving it, which is bad, which is really, really bad. And another topic about preservation is you'll see these large tracts of land that environmentalists want to say, we're going to put this aside and we're not going to use it. And wilderness-like designations that we have to have. But the reality is that's not conservation, because once you have that wilderness-like designation, there's not going to be a power line going through it. There's not going to be a solar on it. There's not going to be wind turbines on it that can create energy for us, because now that area is closed off to everything. And that is not conservation. And that's not what the concept of federal properties was mandated for back at the turn of the centuries. Is it's going to be a wise use, multiple use management, and that's what we need to do. We need to use it for our benefit. And that benefit, ironically, also directly affects the quality of the watershed, the quality of the environment, and the quality of the timber industry. All those businesses that we need to make rural economies thrive are directly related to that land. And we're just ignoring that right now.
Interesting. Land management in New Mexico, I think specifically New Mexico, is quite interesting. Is when you consider the acequias and you consider the land grants and you consider the more than 400 years that we have at least of Spanish settlement in New Mexico, especially in northern New Mexico, and of course, thousands of years of Native American history. We've been able to live and thrive in New Mexico for centuries. It seems like it changed in the last few years.
It has.
And so, I'm sorry, what I'm hearing is you want to find a way to return back to the way that we used to manage our forests, or the way we used to let the communities manage themselves. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, you are. And really, when you talk about the acequias and the water, it's watershed management. Watershed management. If you have all those trees on the landscape that everybody thinks are so beautiful, which they are, I love them, but you got to look at what kind of tree is utilizing that resource right now. What kind of tree is built on that, is living up on that landscape, because that directly is in a direct proportion to the watershed. So pretty soon, it's really hard to have flowing, beautiful acequias if you don't have a good watershed. If you got too many trees, it's just not going to happen.
Interesting.
It's just not going to happen. And you can look at that Rio example, and I'll challenge anybody on this, anybody that wants to fight me on this. Let's go up there and take a look, and I will prove you wrong. Because the watershed management is something we're not looking at. The timber industry, directly correlation with that, is reduced our water. It's reduced it all over the state. And it's critical that we get those things back in check, or we're going to lose it forever. Because sooner or later, Mother Nature is going to hit that reset button like it did in Las Vegas and like it did in Rio, and it's going to start over, and you can't stop it. But we can manage it. We can manage the surrounding environment around those towns, so at least we don't lose lives, and we don't lose family homes that have been there for centuries. It's really a travesty. New Mexico is a beautiful place. I would rather be here than anywhere. I was born here. I lived here. I've loved here. I've ridden horseback all over this state and every wilderness there is. I love working it as a game warden. It's a phenomenal state, but it's being overtaken by this concept of preservation, and we don't need to touch those resources. And we need to have these vast areas of roadless wilderness. And I would challenge somebody, how are you ever going to fight a catastrophic wildfire if there's not a road in there? You're greatly decreasing your ability to save lives, to save homes, to save communities. If all that area behind you is roadless and we're not going to let anybody use it, but we're only going to use it in these certain situations with this certain equipment, you should be able to go back there and use it. You should be able to drive back in there and cut wood with your family, because they've been doing that for generations. It's crazy how many people have actually called me and talked about, hey, can I go cut firewood? If you get in there, were you going to let me cut firewood? And the simple answer is absolutely yes. I want to declare war on a species called the one-seed juniper. One-seed juniper. It's an invasive woody vegetation that's got that bark that you strip off. There is no reason why we shouldn't be allowing anybody to cut that for free. We can't do that because of the anti-donation clause, but we'll figure out a way to get people in there to cut wood at a very, very economical way so they can heat their homes. Because if you don't allow people to do those timber management industry or issues, then all of a sudden you have too much woody vegetation, and then we have to go in and have a prescription to where we have these big tractors cut it down, and it costs money.
And you're talking about just very simple solutions. Just let the people who live in the land use the land.
Absolutely. That's called conservation. That's conservation. When you preserve it, it's a non-use. Nobody gets to use it. Preservationists don't want you to cut wood. Preservationists don't want you to really use the resource in our traditional ways and values. They're against that. And I've seen that on so many ways now that I'm on the county commission. It's just the federal government drives us a wrong direction sometimes.
Why would somebody be a preservationist, considering all the information you just gave and all the experience you have in managing?
That's a good question too, but this is my opinion, but I think it becomes an emotional issue. I think it's an emotional. We got to have more trees. We got to have more open spaces without a wind turbine or a fence running across it, or we don't want a cow on it, or we don't want those
because things. That sounds good. That always sounds good.
But it's not conservation. And when you do that, you create the monotypical type of environment that actually has less species on the landscape. It'll have less species used in that habitat. If you've ever gone hunting or fishing or hunting, let's call it hunting in New Mexico, usually you find that game close to the meadow, and where the meadow and the trees meet, where the farmland and the mesquites meet. That's the edge effect, because a lot of wildlife species use both, right? There's bugs, there's things that the bugs eat, there's things that we eat, there's all those things around the edges. But if you have this monotypical thing, you don't have a multiple diversity in species, so you just don't have species. You just don't have anything there. And we need to get away from that, because it actually creates less of an environment for you and I to do our historical things on. And that's sad, because it can be lost literally in 50 years because we're losing it now. There's less mule deer in this state than there was in the 60s, I promise you. I promise you there's less. And if anybody wants to fight me on that, well, let's go. I'll meet you in any coffee shop and we'll talk numbers, because I've lived it.
It seems like you're challenging your opponents to a debate.
I'm right. I was a game warden for 22 years. I went all over the state. I did it. Helicopter, airplane, snowmobile, four-wheeler, boat, horseback. I've done surveys in places people can't get to. And I've seen the things that affect the species. And I'm telling you, preservation negatively affects wildlife species. It is negatively affects wildlife species. You have
Yeah.
less of it over time. Got to conserve it.
So this is for me very important. I have friends who came from the timber industry in Mora and San Miguel and Española, and they always complain about this. That's why what I'm hearing from you is kind of a return to how it used to be back in the, before preservation is to control of our environmental department, before they took control of the land commission. They lived off the land, and now they can't do that. And some of my friends, they had to move down to El Paso and here in Albuquerque. They just can't do what they used to do.
It's going to be very hard to get back to where we can totally live off the land. I think through the evolution of a lot of things, we're just not there yet as a species anymore.
No.
We're not as rough and tough as we used to be. But I do think that there's a component that we could do, and that's using the land enough to keep people around the resource in a conservation type concept or a mindset where you can actually cut timber and warm your house. So you can actually reduce the cost of fuel, of heating your home, just by simple fuel wood costs. I'm not saying we've got away from that, but we've greatly reduced the ability for our constituents in this state to keep up their historic likes, their historic values, their historic traditions of cutting wood. If you've ever been with your dad or your uncles in the wood, and you're laying out the chainsaw and cutting some wood, it's times like none other. Listening to the AM radio, listening to the Dallas Cowboys get beat again by somebody, even back 20 years ago, and they're still doing it today, right? Listening to the radio and out there doing your thing with Mother Nature, and knowing that because of this day, which is long and hard, I'm going to heat the house and make it better for my family. That's a good and manly thing to do for your family. I've done it my whole life. Even all the game wardens that I ever know, we go cut wood together because we all heat our homes that way.
Yeah.
It's something that we love to do, but it can also fit into the management issue of the preservation versus conservation mindset. And conservation, again, as I said, is the wise use of natural resources. So we got to do that. We got to use that resource wisely. And the timber management industry has greatly been reduced in this state, and it's a shame. It's an absolute shame because people's homes, their livelihood, everything depended on it. And I can equate that to the generation before that got put out of business by the soil bank and erosion, and that were dryland farming. You can go to parts of the state where you can see little houses out on the prairies that used to farm 60, 80 acres there and have a whole community and family there. The Mill and Sand grocery store is gone. All those little towns between Tatum and Clovis and up and down the eastern side of the state that used to dryland farm, when the government started paying them not to farm, they didn't farm anymore. And then their equipment kind of started going south because they weren't using
Why would the
it anymore.
government pay somebody not to farm?
Well, the federal government, and I've seen state agencies do this, but the feds come in every now and again and say, hey, because of water consumption or because of the way your historic culture uses this land, we're going to pay you not to do it. So when they pay them not to do it, and that was dryland farming at that site. Now, you go on the other side of Texas, of New Mexico, right into Texas, you see all kinds of farms. There's farms everywhere. Not so much in New Mexico because we have different water laws, but when you dangle that carrot, somebody's going to take it, and then all of a sudden there's one less farm, and then next year there's two less farms, and then 10 years down the line there's maybe 10 or 15 less little farms, and then those people aren't buying tractors anymore, and they're not buying tires anymore, and they're not going to the grocery store and buying stuff, and then pretty soon their kids move to town and nobody's taking over the family farm, and you kill a culture. They killed that dryland farm culture in eastern New Mexico, and it's happening in real time in the timber management industry because the same thing has happened. As I said many times, in 1990, on Forest Service property across the United States, they cut about 13 billion board feet of timber, and that was timber for industry. That was timber for building things, heating your home, building houses. This last year, it was about 2.6 billion across the United States. And that's greatly decreased because of a thing called the Endangered Species Act. And what they did is I identified a nice little fluffy thing called the spotted owl and said its numbers are decreasing. So to protect that, we're going to have to shut down some timber management. They made it regulatory impossible for you to have a timber management agency or a timber producing sawmill because there was so many regulatory attachments. So just like that dry land farming over time, there's not as many people buying chainsaws. There's not as people buying chainsaw oil and bar oil and gas and tires, and the grocery store goes south. And then pretty soon there used to be 8 timber mills and now it's down to 1 because they're the only one that can survive. And now you go up there 30 years later, there's none. There's no timber industry up there because it's been gutted, and it's been gutted by the Endangered Species Act. Now,
how do we protect the spotted owl, though?
Well,
through conservation.
I think we
not
do it
preservation.
We can do it through conservation, through the wise use of natural resources, and you identify what that owl needs. And if that owl needs old growth forest, well, we can create some areas where their old growth forest is actually encouraged. But I've said this many times, when you look at our forests, they're all the same size diameter of tree. That's a bad environment, and that's where wildlife cannot thrive. So what we need to start doing is taking a management principle where we look at that habitat and say, you know what, we need some old growth forest over here in this canyon. We need to maybe preserve that, but over here we need to have some conservation uses, and we need to have timber management. We need to let people cut wood. This is an area that we need to do some things at. So then you're going to have these edge effects scattered throughout the mountain instead of one monotypical environment that is not really healthy for anything, but is very healthy for wildfires. And if you have that mosaic pattern, high trees, low trees, big trees, little trees, bushes in between, the fire can't moonscape the landscape like it usually does. It just can't do that because that's not how it works. Fires meant, in traditional sense, it burned on the grass, then it burned to the tree, then it burned the grass, and it burned to the tree. And if you think you're smarter than Mother Nature and you kill that process over the last 50 years, then you have trees everywhere, you have no grass on the ground, and then what happens is that when a fire starts, it goes from tree to tree to tree in the tops of the canopy, and it's just like an oven. It gets so hot in the top of the canopy, it bakes everything on the ground. It never even touches the ground because it's up here at 1,000 degrees, and it just blows everything up on the surface. And that's why when you go after a fire, you see white rocks with big cracks in them, no soil, barren landscape, because it just literally cooked everything. Then conversely, the next thing that happens is you get a rainfall, and you went from the rain being caught by all the trees to the rain not being caught by all the trees. It runs off because there's nothing on the dirt. There's no grass, there's no browse species. So all the water goes down the canyon and starts washing out homes down the way. And that's where we're having issues, is we have a catastrophic wildfire. And then some people say, oh, we have global changing and all of a sudden we have flooding. No, it's not, because the 6 times that it flooded houses in Rio Grande this year were normal rains. They were normal rains. Normal rain flows, normal rain season, normal rain cycle. They weren't huge rains, like 3-inch rains. It wasn't like that at all. It was a normal rain, but there was no trees and no grass on the landscapes to catch it, which there should have been. There should be about if you're going to manage for mule deer management, let me put it this way. If you're going to manage for a specific species, mule deer, you want about 35 to 45% cover, closer to 35% tree cover, canopy cover. Name the tree, whatever, but you only want 35% of them living on this area, section, whatever you want to call it. So when you get more than that, you're reducing the deer's ability to live. And when you look at the sandias, I don't even think there's a deer hunt on the sandias anymore. I don't think there's very many deer left on the sandias anymore, but there's a hell of a lot of trees on the sandias.
There are a lot of wild horses, though.
There's a lot of wild horses, which is another issue. Yeah, that's a big problem. And we got to get a handle on that. We got to get a handle on a lot of things, but the landscape management needs to be handled through science, not emotionalism. I call it emotionalism. We did an op-ed on it, and emotionalism is a term that the other side likes to use because they like to tie some heartfelt emotion to a species like the spotted owl and then say, we're gonna not do this use anymore because we need the spotted owl to live. And I want the spotted owl to live. The crazy thing is in some states they're finding that there's an owl called the barred owl the old growth timber has gotten, and the forest has gotten so thick that the barred owl is flourishing and it's eating the spotted owl. It's actually working against them because the habitat is so thick now that not only can the little spotted owl not do as well, but it's a great habitat for the barred owl and it's eating them. So it's having a little bit of a negative effect right now. And that could all be taken care of if we view things through a conservation lens instead of a preservation lens. Nobody has any economic benefit other than, I guess, hiking if you're going to have a preservation mindset. The big roadless rule, the large areas that are covered under these national monument type things, that kills conservation. You can go to places and enjoy them that have been conserved through habitat, conserved through timber management, that have had projects on them. They're going to have a lot more wildlife than areas that are under this preservation mindset, because multiple species just can't survive under that preservation mindset. It doesn't happen that way. I would challenge somebody to debate me on that because they're wrong. You can go out and do wildlife surveys, and I think I said it earlier. I've done them on horseback, snowmobile, four-wheeler, boat, helicopter, airplane. I've done wildlife surveys on every way, even footback. And where you see the most wildlife is on places where conservation managements have happened. And I don't know if a lot of people really understand this, but where does the funding come for conservation efforts? And it comes from the users. It comes from people that hunt and fish and use the resource. Those are where conservation funds come through. In that preservation mindset where you're not a consumptive user, you're just putting in through just your normal tax-based system, which everybody does. But us users are the ones that actually go out and do a consumption of the act, cutting trees, hunting deer, fishing. Those are consumptive uses, but they're also conservatory uses. There's regulations, there's rules. I mean, I was 22 years going around saying, hey, too many fish, man. You can only catch 5, right? Because we want to conserve that for our next generation, for your kids, for my kids. That's called conservation. When you do that preservation mindset, it doesn't
work out. That touches on another subject that I find, especially New Mexico, connects directly to the land, and that's our culture. You know, you go to northern New Mexico, even the ranching and farmland cultures of the Southeast that you say we're losing. And I think many of the people that I know across the state feel that we're losing that connection to the land that we used to have. You know, New Mexico was a rural state, and now it feels like New Mexico might just be dominated by Albuquerque.
And that's sad. And that's really sad because when you talk about rural economy, that's where my life and that's where my love is rural New Mexico. And as a county commissioner, I see that we absolutely have to keep agriculture, livestock industries going, because those are the only folks left that are using that resource. Those are the only economies left, really, if you look at our traditional uses, because a lot of them have gone by the wayside. You just simply can't do it anymore. You know, I was talking to some county commissioners up in the northeastern part of the state, and one of them threw a statistic at me, and it just hit me like, well, what happened? He said, in the next 10 years, it's estimated that we're going to lose 40% of our population in northeastern New Mexico, the country you're talking about. And I said, well, was there an Amazon plant there that closed? Or, what happened? And he said, no, man, it's all the kids left.
Yeah.
The parents stayed, and they're going to be dying in the next 10 years. And we're estimating that we're going to lose 40% of rural New Mexico, rural economy in that part of the world. And that's just sad because we've literally skipped a generation. How are you going to go back now? How are you going to go back to your grandpa's place that doesn't exist?
Yeah.
Because it's been, I don't want to say it's been taken away from us, but it's been lost. And I think sometimes that our non-use management has created an environment where it's hard for you to make a living in rural economy. So you've got to come to Albuquerque to get a job with a newspaper or car salesman or whatever you can do, insurance or whatever you can do, because it's just not available out there anymore. But if we had some of those prescriptions that I say, timber management, agricultural productions, farming, if we could get better at that, we're not going to bring it back, but we'll keep up with the pace and hopefully not lose more than we're.
But could we bring it back? Because if everybody's leaving rural New Mexico, eventually there's going to be a void left. Nobody's going to be working the forest. Nobody's going to be working the ranch. Somebody has to go move back to rural New Mexico to do the jobs that we need to provide food for Americans.
So I think there's a couple of things that are happening on when you talk about that. One thing that I see happen is there's larger corporations that are coming in, maybe even from out of state, that are buying ranches right now, and they're changing that mindset. And then when they buy that one big ranch, maybe somebody that has a big store, like they need to hide some money, some Walmart or some big company from somewhere else comes over and they buy this ranch, and it might I'm not saying it's your grandpa, but let's say it's your grandpa, for example. None of the kids stayed. Everybody left. He's 80. Like, well, all the kids want him to sell it because when he sells it, they get their money or they get their dividends, so to speak. So it's sold, and then that landowner buys another ranch next to it because he needs more of a tax break, or there's a shelter over here. And so you get some of these big ranches, and I'm not against them, but they're against your cultural uses, which I don't think is right, because that's how that landscape was made. That's how it evolved. There's a couple of ranches I work on in northeastern New Mexico that you can still see the wagon ruts from the Santa Fe Trail. And here I'm in my Polaris Ranger doing prescriptive management and writing out things that we need to do on the landscapes. I'm thinking, man, this is the Santa Fe Trail. This is amazing. And it's still kept in one piece by one ranch, and I love it. I mean, I would almost go, I hope they don't see this, but I'd almost go work there for free because it's nice to go see something that's kept whole. And, the whole time that they've had this ranch, it's been under a conservation mindset.
Yeah.
Not conservation easements, not anything other than a conservation mindset. They use their resources wisely, and resources from the ranch have continued to pay for the ranch through hunting and through grazing and those kind of efforts. And they've managed to keep the ranch whole and intact. And I think those traditional uses and those traditional cultures ought to get something for that. They almost ought to have a tax break for keeping something whole and in the culture, whatever that vein is, whether it's Hispanic, Anglo, Native American, whatever it is, it should be kept in that prescriptive culture or mindset, because that's what we need, and that's where we're losing. We're losing that. When you lose the guys that can heat their house with chainsaws, man, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You're losing a lot of that. You can't make a living hardly off the land anymore, but you can still heat your home. And we ought to allow that. You ought to be able to hunt on that property. You ought to be able to do those things. If we do conservation management efforts on some of those habitats, we're going to create more deer. We're going to create more elk. We're going to create more resources that possibly you could feed your family. But right now, under this preservation mindset, where we're more of in a non-use, less species are going to grow across the landscapes, and you're going to be able to do less with it. And that's just kind of economics and business. You can manufacture some things and make them better, but we're going to have to start now. We're really going to have to start now. I've said this many times, but I remember you kind of remember some worthless facts when you're in college. They teach you a lot of things that I don't know. College professors, I don't know what they're teaching nowadays, but I got out in the real world in wildlife management. I thought, man, some of the techniques apply, but a lot of what they told me isn't necessarily what is really going on. But one thing that sticks out in my mind is they said for every year that you have a reduction in fire or you don't have fire, for every year you lose 1% of your grass components to woody vegetation. 1%, which doesn't sound like much, but you can just take one mountain range, take the Capitan Mountains, for example. It's burned twice in the last 50 years, but that didn't start till like 2003, I think. But before that, it hadn't burned for 50 years. And when I looked at those management and I looked at the deer numbers, because I was a district supervisor in that area, and when you looked at what the population of turkeys, deer, and bear were in the 60s, it was 3 times what we had in 2010. And I looked at that and I thought, why is that? But when you look at that one rule of 1% of your browse and your grass vegetation gets reduced for every year you don't have prescription fires, or you allow the fires to burn, then you get this monotypical forest that grows up. And here it is, 2010. I look at it and go, they were harvesting more deer in 1960 on the Capitan Mountains than we have hunters now on the Capitan Mountains. They were harvesting more turkeys back then than we have turkeys on the mountain now. Same with bear. And I think all that goes back to how did they take care of the landscapes at that time? And it's nothing that they were doing, but it was more of you lived with fire back then. We had a lot more fire. We had a lot more wood cutting. We had timber management. We had all of those things that we talked about. So we're kind of circling to where we started with this first question is that what can we do to get it back? We can start living in rural America more like it was 1960, where we actually utilized stuff, where we actually worked hard.
Yeah.
We did those things. We deer hunted, we rabbit hunted. You can't even find a rabbit hardly anymore. You cut wood for your house. They were doing timber management. They were building stuff with wood. All those things that we were doing, we're not doing anymore. And as a result, our wildlife has greatly reduced. And then when you take just that concept of 1% a year, and I'll challenge you guys to go out to your ranches and look at it and go, the meadow used to be 60 yards back that way. 60 yards back there is where the meadow used to be. And you can walk back there and you can see a little tree, a little bit bigger tree, a little bit bigger tree, and then you walk 50 yards and you get to the big trees. Those were the ones that were there 100 years ago, and that's where the edge of the meadow was. So I challenge you to go out and check out some meadows and look for the big trees, and that's where it was. And then you'll know, hey, this guy Mike, he may be onto something.
He knows what he's talking about.
He may be onto something. But that edge effect is what we need to get back. We need to get that watershed back restored. We need to start cutting some more trees. We need to start conserving the natural landscapes instead of preserving them. Preservation is no good for wildlife species. It's really not. People think it is, but it is not.
Yeah, it's
over time. Preservation is bad.
Counterintuitive. And I think the challenge is selling that to an emotionally captive audience. My parents are very much anti-hunters. Their whole life, it's all about preservation. And I kind of grew up in that environment, and it took me. I lived with hunters for a year in Estonia. Really random story. When I was a youth exchange student over there, and it completely changed my perspective of what that means and what it means to live by. But I find it hard to start talking to environmentalists or people who are very much emotionally aligned with nature and say, this is important. If you want to preserve what you love, you have to work with the land, not separate humanity from it.
But you talk about that emotional separation and that emotionalism. There's an emotional tie to preservation. But if you've ever seen a Native American do a ceremonial dance or a ceremonial response to a harvest mule deer, that's an emotional attachment. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's because emotionally they are attached to the land, as are we. But they realize it still to this day that is a very special thing to have the ability to harvest that deer and feed my family and keep it right here. The land produced it, the land produced us, and it's keeping us whole. And then on the other side of it, you have people that totally want to just say, you can't utilize anything because I have an emotional attachment to it. Well, when you talk about those things, you're going against our historic values. As my old Tío Lupe used to say, now you're walking on the fighting side of me, mijo. You're walking on the fighting side of me because this is what I've done my whole life, and this is what I want to keep doing. Well, why can't we do that? And I think we have a little bit of overregulation, over prescribing. I guess the government comes in too much, a little hot and heavy under this preservation mindset, and it's not doing us any justice to our historic uses. It's creating less water. It's creating less watershed. It's harder to get water to the canals and the acequias and the rivers and the farms because the trees are over-consuming the water. I was in Washington, I think 3 weeks ago I sit on the Public Lands Advisory Committee for the National Association of Counties, and we were listening to a seminar by the Forest Service, and they said the forests across the United States are in such poor health right now that there are actually more trees dying than there are trees growing. because the forest health is poor, which means there are too many trees per acre. 100 years ago, there might have been 10 stems per acre, they called it. Now, with the killing of timber management and the inability to go in there and do some timber management and decreasing wildfires that were normal back in the day, we've created a forest that is unhealthy. So the forests are literally dying because there's too many trees competing for the same water resource. They just can't live. You can only put so many mice in a bucket, right? Before some bad stuff starts to happen. It's the same thing on the forest. When you look at trees right now, the ponderosa pine is a species of concern. And when you go look at the side of the mountain and you see this just decadent, dead stand of ponderosa pines, well, it got that way because we didn't allow it to do its thing. There might be, like I said, 100 trees on that little parcel of property where historically there was only 30. Well, 100 trees can't survive anymore off the same watershed. So 70 of them got to go. But what it does is it makes all the trees weak. It makes all of them weak. And what happens is this little critter called a bark beetle gets in there, and he goes in there and he drills his little hole in there, and a healthy tree fills it full of sap and pitches it out. That's called pitch, and it's pitching. And you can go look at a tree and you can see holes in it. You can see them encapsulated.
Yeah, the trees in my house got destroyed by the birds.
That's Mother Nature's way of saying, no, sir, not on this stand. We're in healthy condition, and we're gonna clog you up, beetle, and they kill them. But when you get into that decadent stand it's overabundance of trees, they're all in poor shape.
Yeah.
And so when that beetle gets in there and it drills in there, the tree can't produce the sap because it doesn't have the watershed. So it's trying to live. It's not defending itself. It just has enough energy to live. And that's what's happening across our forests right now. They're in horrible shape, horrible shape. Now, I would say over time, we have mismanaged the forest. We have mismanagement. So you want to call it a preservation mindset, but I call it a mismanagement. Where we're going now is to non-management. Preservation is non-management. We're just going to put it over there in a corner. We're not going to use it at all. And I'm telling you, it's going to be dead. It's going to be dead because it is dying. If you really think about why is it important, there are some species of fish that only exist in certain canyons in this state. Certain canyons, and they are heavily overgrown by forest. One fire, that species is wiped off the planet. Because of preservation, they say, we can't cut those trees. We got to save everything, including that fish. But really, you're hurting the fish. Because if you went in there and you thinned out that forest a little bit, you're going to get more water through rainfall that hits the ground, creates grass species, percolates really nicely and cleanly down to the river, and creates a larger stream bank, a more predictable water flow and watershed, and your fish might make it. But one match and they're gone right now. Under the preservation mindset, we're in trouble.
Would you say that this election matters because if you don't get into the land office, a preservationist will?
I think if I don't get the land officers, and I'm not, when you look at the state land office, it's obviously a statewide political race, and it shouldn't be political. You should have the best person with the best resume get this position to take care of the land for our future generations, to make money for the school children. That's what you need to keep in mind. And we can go into the money aspect of it next if you want, but my life has been working with the lands, and I told you earlier, I can't wait to get my hand on state land. But I want to take care of it for the next generation, to create those species, to create those watersheds, to create those economies that the rural areas need.
I moved back to New Mexico because I wanted my kids to experience the outdoors and have and benefit from the beautiful state that we have.
It's an absolutely beautiful place to live, but we're losing some of it.
Exactly.
We're losing some of our timber. We're not in a healthy component on anything. And if I'm lying, you go out to the forest and tell me it looks good.
No,
because it doesn't. And I just told you there was a study from the Forest Services that said there's more trees that are dying on the hill now that are being reproduced and living because of poor conditions. And there's not one person that could sway me on that argument. Because if that wasn't the case, you wouldn't have catastrophic wildfire. It wouldn't exist.
No.
Because it exists because of our poor management. So we got to look at it and say, hey, before Mother Nature sets a reset button like it did in Las Vegas and it did in Rio Grande, and it wipes out economies, we need to start utilizing that resource in a sound, prescriptive way that follows conservation. That's what we need to do. Absolutely. The other reason I think it's important, the land office, and we hadn't really got into my background, but in 2014 through 2019, I was assistant commissioner over, they call it surface now, but it was field division at the state land office. I was over all the restoration, remediation, watershed management, all that stuff. And I was one of the instrumental components in starting what we call large-scale mesquite sprays. And so the same things that are happening on the forest are happening out on the prairies. Is when you decrease fire over time, mesquites are going to grow, and more mesquites grow, and they're probably the number one or number two water robber of robin in the state. One-seed juniper is horrible, salt cedars are horrible, and mesquites are horrible. So what we started doing is having these large-scale mesquite sprays where we were spraying 10,000 acres at a time. And you can go back in there now, and there's quail species living, there's lizards, there's all kinds of species that have thrived because we've taken out that component of mesquite that was actually robbing water from the other grass species. So you could actually increase your grazing components. If that'd be great for the beef industry right now. If you start having some prescriptive management abilities on the landscape, people that take care of the land are the ones that should be driving what we're doing on the land, not some scientist or preservation saying, this is what I think you need. What we should be doing is listening to our historians. We should be listening to our grandfathers. We should be listening to our fathers that actually work the land and can tell you, this is what's going to happen. And I'll give you a good example. 2 years ago, I was out on this big ranch in northeastern New Mexico, and there was this event happening, and you could literally look across the landscape for 2 miles and see these caterpillars, just thousands of, I even put it on my Facebook page. You could see these caterpillars, and there was so many of them, they were kind of rolling in a line, almost like marching, but they were eating the grass, and then they'd roll and they'd eat the grass. And there was this line of them. You could literally see a line of caterpillars for a mile. And I was telling the other guy, I was like, what is this? He goes, I don't know what that is. Well, a little later that night, we were talking with one of the old ranch hands who had been on that place forever. And I said, hey, what's going on with those caterpillars? He goes, yeah, I knew it was going to happen. I knew we were going to have those caterpillars this year. It's bad for the grass. I knew it was going to happen. I said, when did you know? He goes, well, we had a lot of moths. We had a lot of moths, so we knew we were going to have the caterpillars. I said, well, what causes that? And he goes, I don't know, but I've lived here long enough to know that when we have all those moths, we have all those caterpillars. I was like, wow, if somebody knew that and you wanted to protect the component of grass for your livestock, you could have some preemptive strikes to maybe lessen those caterpillars.
And some state bureaucrat in Albuquerque or Santa Fe will never have that experience of seeing those caterpillars and seeing those moths.
They haven't lived off the land, so they wouldn't even know what it was. And that's kind of my point of that.
One of the most important things that the land commissioner does is generate funds from the land. Tell me about your strategy, your plan. If you become the next land commissioner, how are you going to ensure that we are balancing conservation, productivity, and increasing revenues for our schools and for our state?
Well, that's a really good question. And again, when I was assistant commissioner at the state land office, I saw what we were doing at that time. And the state land office always derived about 40 to 45% of the total school funding, which is a lot in this state. I mean, when you talk about how important is a state land commissioner, the state land commissioner is basically funding half of the schools in the state. So is that important or not? I think it's important because
it's important.
My kid, hopefully my grandkids will get educated just like my kids did. I mean, we all went to public schools, right? But so one thing one statistic I remember from when I was assistant commissioner, and this was just 8 years ago, is that every day the state land office was doing its thing out on the landscape and making money, it was giving school system $1.8 million a day. And back then, again, 8 years ago, that was $585 million. $585 million. Now, of that, 1.8 a day, $585 million, 50% of the total production in the state was coming from state land. 50% of the oil that was extracted was coming from state land, funding roughly 45 to 50% of the school funding. Now you take it to today's metrics. Today's metrics are 5 times higher 2.6 billion, between 2.5 and 2.6 billion in revenues last year were from oil and gas, and that went directly to the schools. Let that sink in. It was 585 8 years ago, with 50% of the production coming from state land. Now it's 2.6 billion, but there's only 30% production coming from state land. So a smart guy would go, well, why is that? Where do the other 20% go? And if you talk to the producers, and I'm calling the producers in this sense, the oil and gas users that are actually, in my opinion, they're taking that. It's a consumptive use. Let's call it that. It's a consumptive use. They're taking that oil and gas and they're extracting it. The regulatory process on state land has been so crude that it's caused 20% of the producers to move to federal land or private land or into Texas. And if you look at some of these large companies, they look at 10 years down the line. All of a sudden, the state land offices become a slow roller on permits. They become a little lackadaisical in their permitting process, according to the users. The royalty increase went from 20 to 25%. So the royalty rate increase. The royalty rate on BLM land is 12.5%. So you're going to pay double the royalty on state land. So over time, it's migrated over to federal and private land, or businesses just have got it out of it altogether and gone to Texas. So again, 8 years ago, $585 million a year at 1.8 a day. Here we are 8 years later, 2.6 billion, but we only have 30% of the production coming from state land. So we've lost 20% of that production. It migrated over to the BLM or to private or even to Texas. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The producers tell me that it's because the state land office has just become too cumbersome to work with on environmental issues. They really don't, they're advantageous, they're aggressive towards the producers from an environmental standpoint, and they just don't want to tolerate it anymore. So they're going to federal land, if you can believe that. Because the federal land royalty is 12.5%. The state land office and the state legislature just went to 25% royalty. So you're paying double on the royalty if you're pulling it off the state land. So a lot of the companies kind of look over there and go, well, 600 yards over there is BLM land. Let's go over there to where we pay 12.5% royalty, less royalty. We have less regulations. They mess with us less. Let's go over there. So as a result of that, over time, I mean, the state land office can correct me if I'm wrong, but they have had a 20% reduction in production. Now, given that, we're still at 2.6 billion, right? We're 2.6 billion. And this is where I like to say, so under a good economy, when oil is booming and banging and producers are doing their thing, even a Democrat can make money. I mean, that's the reality of it, is even somebody that is environmentally conscious and saying, we're doing all these things for the environment, which is killing the industry, they still make more money. I mean, they're coming out of this on cloud nine. They look great. But the reality of it is our state could have a lot more money. We could have 20% more of the 2.6 billion if we were a little more efficient and a little more tolerable of the production, because the reality is it's funding the lion's share of our education in this state. We've got to keep that machine rolling. And as you know, in state government has increased, 800% in the last 8 years? I mean, it went from a $3 billion budget a year to it's up to like 11 or 12 or 13 billion. 12. It's gone up 800%. And that's all on the back of oil and gas. All on the back of oil and gas. And it's because it went from 585 million to 2.6 billion. Now, the other thing about that is, so how do we still need to keep the oil and gas in check. We still need to make sure we're doing the best management practices, the responsible thing. But also know that with that extraction, they're pretty hard on the landscape. But we can also go in there and remediate it, or we can write better contracts and make them remediate it. We can hold people accountable like we have been, and production has gotten a lot more efficient, and it's gotten a lot better. And the oil companies are good at that. Now, their feet were held to the fire by this last administration. I get it. They did their due diligence on both sides, but I think we need to give the nod back to the producers and say, okay, we're going to be more efficient. We're going to get that 20% back, and we're going to make more money for our state. Now, the other side of that is where would I sit on solar and where would I sit on the wind?
Mhm.
So I'm not against them at all. I'm really not. A lady just recently asked me in Carlsbad. She said, this was like 2 nights ago. She said, how's your favorability on wind energy? And I said, ma'am, no pun intended, but I'm not a fan. But I actually am a fan. You need to have a diverse portfolio.
Mhm.
We all need a diverse portfolio
Sure.
because the one thing that we need in New Mexico is energy. We can be an energy dominant state, and we can actually produce more energy than a lot of people and use that to our benefit and sell it to other states. But here's where I think we're going wrong with some of those new energies like wind and solar. So I can say this with great certainty because I'm a vice chair of the Chaves County Commission, and we have a wind project that's been in effect for the last 10, 15 years down in the southeastern part of our county. And we also share that with Eddy and Lee County. And I just recently learned that some of that's on state land. And my wife actually looked this up because she's got that mindset that wants to make sure that we have what's called equity in energy.
Mhm.
Equity and energy. So I just told you that oil and gas is paying 25% now for what they call the sweet spot of production. And that's where in the Permian Basin, you get a new lease there, you got to pay 25%. Well, the wind energy is on the Caprock in southeastern New Mexico. Wind energy they're only going to invest that money if there's good wind there. So that would be called arguably the sweet spot, right?
Mhm.
They're not going to put it somewhere where the wind doesn't blow. So what we recently learned is a royalty rate on that. Guess what that is? 25% oil and gas for the sweet spot. What do you think it is for wind energy?
I mean, I know what it is because you told me in another
Oh, I did.
conversation.
3%.
3%.
Which
Yeah.
to me, there's a gross negligence right there.
Mhm.
They're paying 25 and you're paying 3. That's not cool in my book. And it's the same for solar. The other thing that is interesting is when you look at the energy produced, has your rates gone down from all that energy produced?
No, I
Mine
mean,
haven't gone down either. That energy is going to Phoenix. It's going to Arizona. So all that infrastructure that was put in New Mexico, that energy is being is a product and going to Phoenix. We're not getting anything for that. I think we need to do better for New Mexicans. If we're going to have that type of infrastructure built, we ought to get something more than 3% from it. So my mind goes immediately, and I just drove up here this morning to that Kleins Corners project. When I was the assistant commissioner, there's a large chunk of state land right there around Kleins Corners. Everybody drives by and sees it, and they see these big wind turbines right now. Well, 8 years ago, actually 10 years ago, what we looked at is we needed to provide more habitat for mule deer. I told you, in my opinion, mule deer is a species that's in need. And it's in need because the habitat components in this state through forestry management have declined. So that was one area that was really ripe for the picking because it has great access. It's got great entrance and egress from the interstates on both sides, State Road or 285, and a little further up, State Road 3. So it's got great access. Lots of gates, not easy, not hard for people to get there. You can still go to Kleins Corners and get your ice. Great place to go hunt. But the mule deer species were way down. So what we decided to do is let's have a habitat prescription and let's take out a lot of these trees and get it down to that 35% composition of tree canopy so we could encourage brown species, make some dirt tanks, get it better for the landscape, get it better for mule deer management. And we did that. And the mule deer started coming back, started looking pretty good. And then, of course, a new administration comes in. I retire. 5 years later, 3 years later, I drive through there and I'm like, who put all these wind turbines here? They put the wind turbines right on top of a habitat prescription we did for deer management because that's a species that's in a little bit of peril right now. So the difference in the administrations is we were trying to take care of that for deer management and habitat management and environmental reasons. And then the next administration comes in and says, well, we're going to put wind energy on it right here in an area where everybody can see. And I'm not against wind energy, but on top of that, they're only paying 3%. They don't have any restoration or remediation plans, or they don't have a fund for that where oil and gas does. There's 60 million in that fund right now. Oil and gas has to pay 7/16 or something like 7/16 of a percent of the produced oil as a tax, and they have to put that into an account. And there's anywhere between 60 or $80 million in there that's supposed to go to restoration, remediation, and plugging abandoned wells. That's what that money's for. And twice in the last 30 years, that money has been swept by, let's just call it Democrat administrations at the government side that took that money and put it back into another fund. So it was made for restoration or remediation of the landscapes and the habitat and the oil field conditions. Government took it out of that and put it into another fund and used it for something else. That's happened twice. And thank goodness that a bill was just passed, House Bill 80, I believe it was, that was passed where that can't happen anymore. And it actually got bipartisan support, Democrat and Republican, which is great because we should all be working together on environmental issues. We should all be working together to make sure that we're the policers and the protectors of our environment, to make sure that we can give something to the next legacy that is actually fruitful. So we can get better at these things. We can maintain energy. We can increase our metrics on money for the education and for the public schools, for the public hospitals. But we also need to do a better job of taking care of the environment. And I think my resume shows that I can do that. The hard part for me is, how do you get people in New Mexico to really look and see and read a resume and not just go, well, I'm going to go this way because I'm with this party, or I'm going to go this way with this party. The state land commissioner shouldn't be about party. It shouldn't be about politics. It should be about who's got the best resume and who can take care of the landscapes to our benefit, to my social benefit, to our historic values. And I'm telling you, all over the board, I'm that guy. I check those boxes. I want to be that guy. I want to be the person that gets my hands on that state land and makes it better for mule deer management. It increases the watershed, increases the fire resiliency, that makes it to where we can go cut wood back and heat our homes. That's what I want to do because I'm from a conservation mindset. That's where I want to go.
Great. Well, I agree with you.
Well,
I might disagree a little bit when you say, I understand the spirit of having a nonpartisan office, but I think there is a distinction between the way one party sees land management and the other one sees land management. Because I believe the Democrats running right now are more in the preservation side, less in the land use and less on how we can take benefit from the land and also give back to the land, where we cohabitate or collaborate, as opposed to just, let it be. So I do think there is a very deep philosophical difference between environmentalism and conservationism. So I'm okay with it being partisan. I'll put it that way.
I think as a rule of thumb, you're correct there. But I think we need to do a better job of educating people of what the real process is, what the real project should look like, and what the landscapes could look like. I always laugh when I get behind somebody that has a couple of bumper stickers, and I laugh at them because they'll have something about environmentalism, keeping the wolf, or whatever they have on there. But then there's always a bumper sticker that says coexist. Preservation isn't a coexistent mechanism because you have to use the resource wisely. You have to conserve it wisely. That's what coexistence really is. So I would say that bumper sticker makes me laugh every time I see it, because their idea of coexistence is not reality. It's an emotional bumper sticker that just doesn't fit multiple use, multiple harvests, multiple species. It doesn't fit our cultures.
There's a term for that, which I think the Democratic Party really uses, which is virtue signaling. Many of the policies they do, whether it's environmental, political, safety, security, mental health, whatever it is, it's about what does it make me feel good about myself, more than does it help the community or does it help the land through scientific means or experience. It's how do I feel about my policy? And I've seen that a lot in, like I said, in other subjects. I'm not as knowledgeable on these issues as you are, but I definitely see it when it comes to environmentalism.
Oh, you're exactly right. And when you bring that to light, that's where I go back to, how do you get people to read resumes, and how do you get people to know what I'm about and what I am? Because I'm not against anybody.
Well, hopefully people listen to this podcast.
Well, I'm absolutely for the environment. I want my grandkids to hunt quail here like I did.
I'd
I
love
mean,
to.
there's places in this state down by Deming in the Hachita Mountains and
Oh, it's
the
beautiful.
Floridas.
It's my favorite part of the state.
It's beautiful.
The Boot Heel is my absolute favorite part.
And I quail hunted back in the 80s with my granddad in that country. And I want to take my grandkids back there. I absolutely love that country.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a conservationist. I was taught that when I was 10 years old, hunting quail with my granddad down in that country. I love it.
Yeah.
Because it's the wise use and it's the multiple use and it's the sustainability. And, you just look at quail hunting, for an example. We went and bought gas. We fixed flat tires. We did all that in Deming. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole different economy that is needed, and it's driven, and it's a force multiplier to everything else. The gross receipts tax of that county is so important. And I see that as a county commissioner. How do we?
And Luna
how do we
County
get those
specifically is
economies
suffering
back?
quite a lot right now.
Say again?
Luna County specifically is doing pretty poorly.
Yes, it is. And there's some really, really good people down there. I went down there to a meeting that they had, and I was surprised that there was 140 people that showed up to listen to my platform. I was taken aback that many people showed up to listen to Michael Perry talk about resource issues on state land.
Interesting.
I would never imagine that. But that's rural economy, and those are the folks that we need to visit with. Those are the folks that should be driving what the state land office does, because it's their land, it's their interest, and we desperately need to have them have a seat at the table. I've talked to several grazing lessees that they realized that there are multiple use energies that are coming up, like solar and wind. But one of them told me just recently, the bad part about the state land office is they're in such a push right now to have green energy that they just walked all over my use. They walked all over my historic culture. They walked all over the historical significance of this valley or this region. And to take it down to a simple note, he said, they just don't listen to us. They cut a road right here that went through 3 corners of 3 pastures where all my cows from all this country water. Now I got a road with trucks, and it's a 60-foot easement that they got because they paid more for it, but they go right through the middle of my historic grazing regime. They're counterproductive to my grazing principles. Now I have to move my infrastructure because it's been ruined by this green energy. Well, that doesn't mean that we don't want green energy. That just means that we didn't listen to the guy on the ground or the person on the ground or the family on the ground and say, hey, let's all work together here. Yeah. We got this industry coming in. They're going to make a road. Where would it least impact your operation? That's not a question that's asked anymore. There's no questions that are asked. The current avenue is, this is where we're going to do it, and you're going to like it. That's not fair. No. That's not fair at all. So even with solar companies and some county commissioners from surrounding counties in Chavez, we talk about it because we've got a lot of solar interests that are coming up in Lee, Roosevelt, Eddy, Chavez, Curry. And what we've really come up with is a kind of a sideboards of, there's agricultural communities that need to stay in existence. There's agricultural land that needs to stay in existence. But over here on this property, it's not a really good soil. It's not really good for grazing. It's not good for farming. It's not good for agriculture and our historic uses. It's historically not used because of the soil or where it's at, or geographically, it's just a little weird and it just doesn't produce much through a habitat component. So why don't we encourage solar and wind companies to do something on that property and not take something out of prime agricultural existence? Because once a solar company or a wind farm has their components placed on that property, it's likely never going to be in agricultural uses again. And that's our historic value. That's what we do. And you can take that a couple of different avenues, but still I go to that's conservation. If you had a preservation mindset, if you truly had a preservation mindset, there wouldn't be any wind and solar anywhere near Klein's Corners.
No.
There would not be. So a lot of times people like to take, I'm an environmentalist, I'm touting, I'm an environmentalist, I'm a preservationist, but then they put a wind project right on top of where we did a mule deer management project to increase fire resiliency, deer management, and increase watershed capabilities. and put a.
And what's the logic behind that? Did they want to have a windmill right where people can see it?
I think the windmill
Was it
coming in.
Was it the image of it?
Well, I guess maybe the current administration and the current heartbeat, or the past heartbeat, 8 years ago, was we're gonna make policies that are hard on oil and gas, and then we're gonna make policies that kind of lift up green energy. And as a result, here we are. I told you oil and gas pays into a remediation fund. Oil and gas pays a 25%, and then their bonding's getting ready to go up. So you got wind and solar that pays 3%. They do not pay into a remediation, which means when they go defunct, which they are in Texas, what are we going to do with that? Who's going to take that down? And their bonding's entirely different. So there's policies that are against one and for the other, and that's, in my opinion, that's not fair. I was a law enforcement officer for 22 years. You have to live in the four corners of a document of people's rights. You got to treat people fairly, and you got to be fair, or you're going to get sued. But the state land office, I think, currently takes this mindset of, we're going to do this because it's green and it looks good, but we're going to step on this historic use, which to me is not cool.
No,
you're overlooking some things, and to be honest, I think you're being rude about it. It's just not cool to treat people that way. I wouldn't do that.
No,
it's not right. So that's my thought on that. I'm for a divorce portfolio, but I think we need to be fair about it.
Well, I agree with that. Let's wrap this up. How can people get involved, support you? Any closing statements?
Most people that are just getting into this say, I'm a grassroots movement. And I understand what that means now, because that means you're alone. Grassroots mean I'm alone. I'm by myself. I have a beautiful wife that's helped me, who has a beautiful mind for these processes. I have a great resume to do this job, but I need people to get involved and start researching the resume, prove me wrong.
Yeah.
Look at the other folks that are running against me. There's 3 on the other side. I'm the only one on the Republican side. I'm the best candidate on the Republican side. And I think they saw that early on and said, no, we got this one. We need to go find some other offices to run for, but we got this one. So they're still trying to figure that out on their side, but I need people to get involved and research my resume. I need them to go to perry4nmland.com and look at my website. They can go to Michael Perry for Land Commissioner on Facebook and read all of the wonderful projects that we're working on, the places that we've been, and a lot of my viewpoints. I have an Instagram page, and it was just always my Instagram page that I put my wildlife stuff on. It's Michael Jack, Jakk Perry, because that's my middle name. I guess somebody else had Jackr, so I had to go Jakk. And you can look at my Instagram post, and it can tell you about who I am. But that's where I have my nice pictures of wildlife and the stuff that I've done on the landscape. The Facebook page is more of where we're going and what we're doing.
Policy.
But I just need people to really take their head out of the box, look at resumes, and say, this isn't politics. This guy really has a heart in this. This is a good guy. And I got to tell you, putting myself out here, putting my family out and doing this, it's very hard.
Yeah.
I don't know why anybody would want to run for a statewide office. I really don't, because it's grueling. We were in Tucumcari one day, Hobbs the next, Roswell the next. We're here today. It's every day you're going somewhere.
Yeah.
So look me up. Look at my resume, look at the other guy's resume, and make a well-educated and rational decision on where you want the state land office to go in the next 4 to 8 years. Because I'm not doing this for the money. I already have a state pension. I have a nice little business that is a side business that I haven't been able to do because I'm running for this. But this is all in my heart. This is who I am. This is what I do. This isn't about going to the next level. This isn't about trying to become something bigger political. I don't do politics. I'm not a politician. I'm here to do the right thing for the landscapes and the right thing for our historic values and uses for this state.
Well, I'm right behind you. And thank you so much for joining me here today and taking the time to come up to Albuquerque and talk about these important issues. For me, this is, every race is important, but the Land Commission race is especially important because so much depends on who our land commissioner is in terms of preserving, I don't want to use that word, conserving our, the most important resource we have, which is our beauty, our nature and our culture, our heritage and our people. So thank you so much. And
thank you for giving me the time. I appreciate it. I'll come anytime. I'll speak to anybody, anywhere, anytime. Just give me
You
a
guys
call.
heard that.
Yeah, you
right.
heard it. I'm not afraid.
Great.
I got a truck. I'll gas it up. I'll be there.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Well,
sir.
thank you so much.